to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Today's guest is Dr. Steve Miller, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Kennesaw State University. Today, Dr. Miller and I are going to be discussing Volume 3 of his book titled, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences? The Surprising Presence of Jesus, Scarcity of Anti-Christian Elements, and Compatibility with Historic Christian Teachings. It's an excellent book. I'll try to get it so that you can see it on the screen there. Dr. Miller, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure and an honor to have you. You write about one subject in particular that has interested me for a very long time, and that's the near-death experience. I started looking into the near-death experience back in the late 1990s when my aunt was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She was undergoing some radical experimental treatments, and I stumbled across Dr. George Ritchie's accounts on the internet, and that sparked an interest that has been with me until this day. But reading your first two volumes, I never thought of the deathbed experience as something worth researching. So talk a little bit about the deathbed experience. What are some of the typical attributes or characteristics of a deathbed experience?
Okay. Let me first of all say I think that George Ritchie's book is very seminal to the whole study of near-death experiences. When Moody, who wrote his book in 1975 on near-death experiences, which really was seminal to this whole study that broke out after that, it was Ritchie, who was a psychiatrist at the school Moody was attending, where Moody was first exposed to somebody in recent times that had had such an experience. And he's a very legitimate person, a very well-respected person, a psychiatrist, a doctor who shares his experience. So when I began studying near-death experiences about a decade ago, because a relative had given me a copy of the little book, Heaven is for Real, and wanted me to look at it, and I really wasn't that interested. I just did it as a favor to a relative. I thought, these are just personal testimonies. What could they really mean as far as evidence? And I read it, and I thought that would be pretty good evidence if I knew the family and I trusted them and had reason to, or if this was in the context of a study. But it's really not strong evidence. I was really into apologetics as far as historicity of the New Testament documents, those type things. I was used to sifting evidence. But there was a little blurb on there that said by a physician who said that he had studied these experiences for years and that this experience was consistent with what he had found in his research. And I thought, somebody's been studying these. So all that led me to dig into the research that's been done on near-death experiences and try to see if that had evidence for the afterlife and for God. And I conclude it did. But during that study, I found some research that had been done on a similar experience. Near-death experiences are experiences where someone has died maybe in a cardiac arrest and experienced clinical death, cessation of heartbeat, cessation of breathing, and then they're resuscitated, come back from that, and have a story to tell about something that happened extremely significant and life-changing during the time when their brains should have been shut off. And now I saw that as containing some evidence in itself. But the deathbed experience is one where somebody is experiencing their final death. So maybe someone has been in a coma for a long time and all of a sudden wakes up perfectly lucid on their deathbed and says their goodbyes to people where their brain shouldn't have been working at that time if they were going downhill from Alzheimer's or some diseases that mess with your brain. But they say their goodbyes, seemingly knowing they're just about to die, and then they die. That's terminal lucidity, something that often happens at death. Other people are very aware right up until the time they die and experience angels on the other side, or they're talking to deceased relatives. When they start doing this, people who work for hospice often say, ooh, these people are pretty close to death, because when they start making this transition, this is typically at the time of death. So I thought somebody needs to study more into that to find out what research has been done. I was interested in getting a PhD, and I thought, I wonder if I could find a place that would let me do my dissertation on deathbed experiences. Columbia International University allowed me to do that in a very broad PhD program. And I thought, hey, maybe I'll find 100 or so studies on deathbed experiences, which would make a good, tidy dissertation. When I got to about 700 articles, I thought, wow, a lot has been done over time. Somebody needs to bring this together. So that's when I got in deathbed experiences and wrote my book on that.
It's a fascinating subject. Now, there is some overlap between the deathbed experience and the near-death experience, wouldn't you say? As far as seeing deceased relatives and um, sometimes seeing angels, those aren't exclusively a characteristic of one type of experience versus the other, is it?
For me, this was corroborating evidence to the evidence that I'd found with near-death experiences. Here's another experience, like a sister experience. It doesn't contradict near-death experiences, but it's very similar in that people believe fully that these are real. They don't come out of them saying, wow, I've been hallucinating angels, or wow, I had a dream of angels. They'll say, if you start questioning them, they'll say, no, I really believe that was my deceased mom that I was talking to. And I really believe that's an angel that I talked to. So extremely realistic, profound, life-changing experiences. Yes, they tend in both experiences. You talk about seeing angels, heavenly beings on the other side, deceased relatives, many similarities, and the differences don't contradict, but they're significant in that. Okay, let's say that this could all be explained by naturalistic causes from a dying brain. In both situations, near death and deathbed experiences, you've got a severely compromised brain that may die at any time in a near death experience if you're having a cardiac arrest. So, in both experiences, you've got a dying brain, and yet in a deathbed experience, I've never heard anybody talk about a life review. Why would that be? They're pretty common in near death experiences, but if you think about it, if these experiences are being orchestrated or directed from the other side, like from God, God's allowing this to happen, why is it happening? In a near death experience, that's a halftime experience. You're going to come back and have the rest of your life to live. And so it makes sense that you would get a life review as a checkup to see how you're doing in life. And it radically changes typically people's idea of what's important, what's not. Is materialism really all that important? Ooh, it's really more about relationships and about God. That makes sense in a near-death experience. In a deathbed experience, they don't have but a few minutes left or a few hours left of their life. Why would they need to see a review of their lives prior to death? I think they're about to have that in a final judgment, right? After their final death. So it makes sense that they wouldn't have a life review in their deathbed experience. Also, you don't hear anybody talking about going to the other side and somebody talking to somebody about whether to return or not. Why? They're not going to return. There's no decision to be made. And yet, often in a near death experience, you have people going to the other side, talking to an angel or talking to God and having a discussion on, do you want to come on over to the other side, or do you need to go back to finish some work that's unfinished? Very fascinating. I think they dovetail. The evidence of one corroborates the other, that there really is an afterlife. There really are personal beings on the other side. There's really a God. Your life matters. All these things are corroborated and I think underscored by both experiences.
One of the things I liked in particular about your book was that you took an academic approach to the material, meaning that you didn't just look for things or for examples that affirmed your beliefs. You asked the questions that an atheist or a non-believer or a skeptic of materials would ask. You ask about, could this be an hallucination? And you give very compelling evidence that I tend to agree with, that it isn't something that can just be explained away with purely material explanations, because you've got corroborated veridical perceptions that are associated with NDEs in particular, where people create new memories or gain information while they're in this allegedly incapacitated state. And I know that in your book you cited Pam Reynolds as one example. What are some of your favorite examples of NDEs?
What I tried to do is to stick with the testimonies, the cases that were given by legitimate students of NDEs. So you've got Sabom, who's a very respected cardiologist, taught at Emory University. Van Lommel was a cardiologist in the Netherlands and published his experience or his research in the Lancet, which is one of the top medical journals in the world. So rather than just running around on the internet and finding things that agreed with my theology, I said, let's just see what the best researchers have found regarding near death experiences and deathbed experiences and pull together their research. So that was what I was trying to do. Regarding naturalistic explanations, what I found is it's really quite odd that you have these naturalists who will keep coming back saying, oh, I think these are just caused by brain activity of a dying brain, such as lack of oxygen or too much oxygen, or their hallucinations. And they still say those things to this day. But Moody, back in 1975, he said, hey, there are lots of possible naturalistic explanations, like not enough oxygen, too much oxygen, hallucinations. And he went through each one of these and showed why he felt like they were inadequate to explain it. Now, since 1975, you have these researchers who have put these naturalistic hypotheses to the test. Since some people are studying near death experiences where they've actually got the doctor's records, like Sabom or Van Lommel, you could look and see, okay, they were checking the oxygen levels. And you say a lot of these were not lacking oxygen when they were reporting this, or had too much oxygen while it was going on. And let's compare Sartori and her research for her dissertation on near death experiences in England. She said, let's compare. I'll not only take experiences of near death experiences, but let's take all the experiences of people near death who also have hallucinations, and let's compare the two and see if they're the same. And they were very different. Typically, people who had hallucinations would come back afterwards and say, oh my goodness, what a hallucination I was having, because it's unrealistic in many ways. Maybe a person who had terrible burns would see themselves on a spit where you're over a fire being cooked by somebody, but they were just wild. They differed tremendously in the content, right? And yet when it comes to near death experiences, why is there this core that happens over and over, regardless of culture, regardless of the country it's coming from, regardless of your religious views? Why do they see themselves coming out of the body, viewing their body from outside? having life reviews, going through a tunnel. Why this consistency? Whereas if it were a hallucination, you'd expect just almost infinite variety. So I tried to look at those naturalistic explanations, not to destroy them, but to say, hey, do any of these make sense? Or is that the most likely explanation? And just found them to fall short.
Many of the characteristics of an NDE have been documented by Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia. And it was this, I don't know what you call it, a document that's called the Grayson scale, where there's 17 different attributes of an NDE, and they can ask these questions to the person that claims to have had the experience, and then they grade the experience based on their answers, and they can quantify it to some degree. Is there anything like that with a deathbed experience?
Nobody's really come up with a scale, but many of those would be similar to for a deathbed experience. Again, you would just take off the ideas of the life review or the decision as to where to come back. It could easily be developed, and somebody ought to develop that. The rationale for a scale like that. Now, what I did come up with a friend who is researching these is what I call the gray scale because his name is Gray. And we work together to say somebody needs to sit down and say, people share all these experiences over the internet. Some of these people were on drugs. Some of these people have mental illness. Some of them are just crazy wacko. Some of them are just somebody's visions, but they're sharing it as if it were a near death experience. Okay. They're not even saying they were near death at the time. So somebody needs to come up with red flags to say, when you see this in an experience, let maybe it's not really a near death experience. And so we came up with a lot of things. For example, if somebody shares about a near death experience and then they start telling about all these other similar experiences they've had, and it's like this person's been near death like 5 different times in their life, that just seems a little bit odd. And a lot of times in situations like that, the experiences get wackier, and you say, I think there may be maybe some schizophrenia involved in here. Maybe they had a legitimate experience, but I think I need to take this one with a grain of salt and set it aside. Or if a person says they were doing mushrooms and then I had this near death experience, perhaps they overdosed on something and had a legitimate near death experience. But if they're on mushrooms, you're saying maybe this is a psychedelic experience, so I don't need to take it as a true near death experience. I ought to go back. I didn't fully answer your question earlier. You were asking about my some of my favorite experiences, and I deflected and said, I tried to get experiences in mass from people who had done the research. But I would like to mention the Pam Reynolds experience. You've probably talked about it here before, but that is pretty extraordinary. Dr. Sabom, who taught at Emory, again, taught cardiology, he's the one who first went in and did the research on her experience. I could just read a little of it. She underwent a risky brain surgery that required lowering her body temperature to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, draining out all the blood from her head by 3 primary tests: a silent EEG, an unresponsive brain stem, and no blood flow to the brain. She was clinically dead. Now, in a state like that, you're not having hallucinations or memories. Your brain is shut off. The blood has flowed from your head. You're not going to be having experiences. Even if you had some slight something going on in the brain, your brain wouldn't be able to lay down the memory for the future. So she's clinically dead. Yet after the surgery, she reported being very much alive during surgery, viewing the procedure from outside her body. Okay, now so I'll say, okay, so maybe the experience happened as she was being put down to sleep, or when they restored the blood and she was coming back to consciousness. But what she reported were things that were happening during her surgery when the blood was drained, when they had 100 decibel clicks assaulting her ears over 10 times a second to monitor her brain activity. Her head was covered to where she could see nothing, and yet she very accurately described things going on in the operating room, including some very specific tools used for that procedure that Dr. Sabom was not even familiar with. He had to go look up the records of the descriptions of these tools to see what they were using. And he said, wow, she described it as like of the shape of a toothbrush that was used for something. And sure enough, he looked at it and there was the description matched. What Sabom did on a broader scale is he compared his patients and the patients that he interviewed that he had records on. And he said the ones that had near death experiences when they had their cardiac arrest, he said, what happened during your recovery, during your resuscitation? And then he had a control group of patients who had also experienced cardiac arrest but did not have a near death experience, and said, you tell me what you think happened during your resuscitation. That way, he could see if the people with the near death experiences had just seen enough on TV to where they could guess correctly or not. The result was the people who had had near death experiences were saying that they gave really just an amazing accuracy of specifics that were happening, and they differed from situation to situation. You think resuscitations are all the same, they're really not. The ones who did not report a near death experience always got it wrong. So Sabom said, and he started off skeptical. It took him a year of this research before he concluded, wow, these people were really outside of their bodies. I didn't think that could happen as a medical professional. So he drew that conclusion. Very good book, very scientifically done, very carefully done, not popularly written, but if you're into the evidence, Sabom's book is a good one. It's called Recollections of Death.
I'll have to get it. I also found Pam Reynolds' NDE account to be extremely compelling, given the detail of it, with her eyes being taped shut. And as you had mentioned, the nodules in her ears that were to prevent her from being able to hear. Yet in that state, she recalled the conversation, very specific, and was able to describe the tools that the doctor used as being like a dental drill or a tool that you'd find in a dentist office. And I was interested because there was an anesthesiologist named Gerald Worley, who's an Australian. I think he's in the Netherlands now, but he's written this detailed account. He used to have some really cheesy looking website that tried to dissect the NDE second by second. And just to cut to the chase, his final analysis was that she suffered a combination of anesthesia awareness and other things, that she was able to, in spite of the nodules in her ears, hear the drill and associate it with a dentist tool, and came up with that description just purely by luck and hearing things and being in a state where she wasn't feeling any pain. She was under extreme anesthesia, but she was awake at the same time. That's his claim. And my response to him is fine. Take Pam Reynolds out of the equation. You still have Mary Neal's account. You still have Colton Burpo's account. And then there's one that I don't know if you've heard of. Are you familiar with Michaela Roser? And I think her married name is Chatterjee.
No, I'm not. In fact, I don't read popular accounts. I just read the researchers' accounts because they're vetted better.
Yes, absolutely. That's the better approach doing research. But unfortunately, you're the professional and I'm the amateur. So I watch all these shows like I Survived, Beyond and Back, and The Unexplained, and things that are shot in a documentary style, and they're supposedly presenting real information and they have real interviews. The I Survived Beyond, no, it wasn't I Survived. It was a different program, but it had interviews with Dr. Spetzler, who was Pam's neurosurgeon, Dr. Sabom, who had done the research, and all of the information was presented for Pam Reynolds. It was a very compelling account. But as I say, if you take that account out of the equation, there are thousands more that have
Mhm.
corroborated veridical examples. Now, Colton Burpo's NDE is interesting to me because he's got an example of corroborated veridical information in it, in remembering details of his mother's miscarriage and allegedly seeing his deceased sister in heaven. But then he also described a horse that Jesus was riding as something that is impossible for an ordinary human to fathom. It's painted with every color of the rainbow, or it's some sort of fantastic horse that Jesus was riding in this that sounded more along the lines of a hallucination than an actual experience. Do you think it's possible that some of these experiences could be a combination of two different things, where part of it you are in a state where your brain is dying and you're creating these memories, quote unquote, that aren't accurate or valid, and then lucid information somehow comes into the equation and you learn this information while you're in this incapacitated state? For example, Mary Neal found out that her son was going to die in the future while she was drowning
Mhm.
on a rafting trip. I know that about Mary Neal's account because you
Mhm.
wrote about her in the book. Michaela Roser's account was really fascinating, and I would encourage you to look into her account. She was traveling back with her family on a vacation, and there was a terrible car accident, and they had to life flight everybody out of there. And sister and brother that were in the back seat, they were all had to be life flighted. But Michaela, her brain had twisted inside of her skull, and they
Mm.
said that the odds of her survival were less than 5%. The doctor who had treated her on the scene said that she was so far gone that he was able to intubate her without any drugs at all. He just
Mm.
stuck the tube down her throat. They rushed her to the hospital. They did emergency surgery, saved her life. While she's in surgery, her family gathers in the hospital cafeteria. Her father, mother, and then the maternal and paternal grandmothers are all sitting there together. And the father was a smoker and said, "The stress of this is really getting to me. I've got to have a cigarette." And both the maternal and the paternal grandmothers said, "We're going to have a cigarette with you." And when Michaela came out of her coma several weeks later, one of the very first things that she said to her mother was, "I can't believe both of my grandmothers are smoking cigarettes while I'm in surgery." And it freaked her mother out because in her mind, there was no way for her to know that information unless she was able somehow to physically leave her material body in the emergency room or in the operating room and physically travel in an incorporeal state into the cafeteria and witness this event. Now, skeptics might say that she overheard a conversation or something like that, but why would somebody even talk about smoking a cigarette inside the hospital room while she's in there in recovery?
Yeah,
It,
so I think what we've got here is corroborating evidence, and I haven't studied that account. I'd have to go into it and say, okay, is this somebody I trust? Are they just writing a book to make money? Or where did it come from? That's why I kind of stick with the main researchers. But even within the research, you've got people like Gary Habermas, very respected intellectual in apologetics, who's collected many of these with corroborating evidence, veridical, we would call them. There's evidence that they really saw things they couldn't have seen before. One interesting one was on in the New York Academy of Sciences. There was a conference on resuscitation techniques and what is death. Sam Parnia was the main interviewer of a group of 4 people on the panel. One of the people on the panel was a very respected person who specialized in emergency room procedures, and I believe the University of Wisconsin, one of the medical schools there. These are extremely respected people who don't need to tarnish their reputations with telling wild stories, right? But about three-fourths of the way through that panel discussion, this Dr. Ofterhouse starts talking about his first experience as a doctor when somebody was supposed to be assisting him going through the rounds, a more experienced person, but the experienced person decided to go take a nap somewhere, left him in charge. Somebody experiences cardiac arrest. Days later, the person who was just uh, out of consciousness over and over, was not aware of what was going on all through the night, began to tell him about very specific things that were happening. One of the specific things being Dr. Ofterhouse's thoughts during the time he was there. And he said that the doctor said, I could explain away some of the things that the person was saying. Maybe he overheard somebody later saying this and that and just thought it was a memory. But how did he know my thoughts? The specific thoughts being that he was feeling sorry for himself because his supervisor was not there with him. How would the patient have known that just from his thoughts? And he said that's what had convinced him that the brain is more than just something physical, but in that sense, while this person was out of it, they had separated from their body in some way. There are plenty of experiences. Let me make one more suggestion along that line. Yes, you mentioned Dr. Worley, and I appreciate people like him as naturalists. I assume he's a naturalist because he argues against the authenticity of near-death experiences from a scientific standpoint. I appreciate when the naturalists chime in and say, hey, maybe this happened, maybe this happened, maybe this happened, to explain Pam Reynolds. But when I look at it, I say, okay, that's a hypothesis we ought to put up there that these are naturalistic explanations. But when you compare it to the information we have on what happened in her case, how was she having awareness, according to Dr. Worley, from what you were saying, at a time when the blood was drained out of her head? You shouldn't have awareness. Read Dr. Sabom, read other professionals who studied this. You shouldn't be having any kind of experiences there. It's not just that you were put to sleep, but the blood was drained out of your head. Your ears were being assaulted with all these sounds. How could you have heard and made something up from it? So I just think his hypothesis doesn't work. And on getting experiences, rather than just going on the web and hearing this and that, you're going to hear all kinds of experiences out there. I'd suggest start talking to your relatives and circles of trust. And in my case, I started finding people that I've known and trusted all my life telling me about wild experiences that they had never admitted before. Like one who had a shared death experience when his father died in a hospital hours away. He wasn't even aware that his father was in any kind of sickness, much less having a heart attack. But he experienced feelings of a heart attack, like a Mack truck was sitting on your chest, came out of his body, saw a light in the corner of his room, saw other things, came back into his body, immediately got a phone call from a nurse from hours away saying his dad had just died of a heart attack. Well, that's somebody from my circles of trust, somebody who's taught history all his life, has a master's in history, very reliable, respected person with no motivation to lie to me about it. I think when you start talking to people around you that you trust, you'll find out these experiences are pretty widespread, and some of them have good indications that they're real. Like, why? Okay, yeah, maybe Bucky just had a wild experience in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, but why did it happen at precisely the same time that his dad died? That's a little harder to answer.
You mentioned your friend Bucky, and you said in your book that he had said or suggested that he'd had multiple near death experiences. And one of the questions that came to me as a result of that was his description of one of his near death experiences I wouldn't really call a near-death experience. He
Right.
was
So
driving
Bucky
down the
said,
road. He was driving down the road, and he
mm,
anticipated, or he had this premonition that something bad was about to happen. And as he came over the crest, there was a car accident. And if he'd been going normal speed, he would have hit it. But if he'd hit it, then he would have had a near-death experience. It
so initially, Bucky said, my mother, we were at my mother's house, and my mom said, "Tell Bucky what you're studying." And I said, "Near death experiences." He said, "Oh, I've had 3 of these." Now I see why he called them near death experiences, because he could have died. But actually, for someone who studied near death experiences, I'd say, okay, he had a shared death experience that night.
yes.
He had a premonition in the second one. He didn't have multiple experiences where he had cardiac arrest or something and had a near death experience. But both of them were evidential in that he did not know that he was about to potentially have a wreck. He did not know what was over the crested hill, and yet he got a warning of it beforehand. So there are really multiple experiences, visionary experiences, that have evidential components. And I think all of these provide corroborating evidence that sometimes we learn things through visions. And in fact, with deathbed experiences, I believe brings several types of experiences together that involve near death, some of them happening to the people who are not actually dying, such as when someone sees a relative who has just passed away coming to say goodbye to them, and they just know that, wow, that person must have just died. And it may be days later till they find out that this relative actually died, and maybe they died on another continent. How did they know that? What about the timing? And they don't normally have experiences like that. The only time you have that experience is when you actually experience the deceased relative. These, again, I go into them in depth, exploring them. Why should I believe these? Is this just somebody saying it and I don't know the person? Who's doing the research? Do I know this really happened? And there are some excellent researchers who actually trace down the evidence to corroborate the experiences that they shared.
That's one of the things that skeptics or critics love to do is ask the motive of why the story's coming forward. And in the case of Colton Burpo, there's 11 million reasons for it. He did sell quite a few copies of that book. But then in the example of Michaela Roser, and I don't know that Mary Neal wrote a book either. Both of them
She has a book.
deliver. Oh, she does. Okay.
Mhm.
But Michaela Roser, to the best of my knowledge, she's never written a book.
Okay.
So she only gives her testimony in public speaking.
But it's just
And
like in a court of law. You have to assess a person's testimony as to they have a motivation to be lying or fabricating or exaggerating. Are they known as a reliable person? So you use the same techniques we would use in a court of law to evaluate testimony. Some people just throw out all testimonies. And I'm like, you can't do that. That's our whole legal system would fall to the ground if you didn't allow for eyewitness testimony by reliable people as a part of your research. Even when you're dealing with forensic evidence like fingerprints or DNA, you bring in an expert to testify that this really is the same DNA as this other person. Again, you're relying on the testimony of an expert. So you can't throw out all testimony. You have to evaluate testimony to see when it should be believed. And that's why I'm telling people, go out there and study the best research on that and on these experiences, see what they found, but then start talking to your relatives and your circles of trust. And I think most people, they're so common that you'll be astounded to find it coming from people that have no reason to lie. They're not writing books about it, and they're already in your circles of trust. You know these people.
that's one of the things that had confused me in reading your book was that you had suggested that the level or the percentage of NDEs per total population was only like 4 or 5%. And I was thinking from personal experience, I know that when I have just expressed interest in these things, that I've had people just volunteer them. But by the same token, in your book, you give a good example, and it's that Dr. Ofterhide. He had a
We're
patient
probably
that
both mispronouncing it, but
it does, but we know who we're both
not
talking
everybody can
about.
be Steve Miller and John, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But in his account, he said had a patient that told his pastor, and the pastor said it's not biblical. So he told the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said it's nuts. It's not possible. So who do you tell if everybody's going to tell you that what you're telling them isn't feasible, isn't realistic?
This is a big problem. I was talking to a missionary just yesterday about, he's a lifelong missionary, about his experiences overseas. And when he would have a seemingly something that he knew was a really spiritual experience, either with something demonic or angelic, he would try himself to explain them in naturalistic terms because that's what he was used to growing up. He was more a dispensationalist theologically, so he didn't tend to believe in these manifestations these days, or his first response was to explain it in naturalistic terms. But he for sure wasn't going to start telling other people because they'd think he was nuts. Now, because of this prejudice, I think through the 1800s into the present day, because of this naturalistic prejudice against such things, we're very hesitant to share them. So the 4% of people who admit to having NDEs may be very low, because especially if you've had a negative near death experience, you're not going to tell somebody that you experienced hell. And you may have submerged that and tried to just not even think about that for years. So the percentages may be much higher than we think. In deathbed experiences before a person's in their final death, when they did a survey in a hospice unit, in where people actually go into the unit in New York, they actually asked the patients each day, have you had any experiences like this? And over 80% of them reported having the experiences. And then if you add to that visions of angels, other types of experiences like this, I'm wondering if almost everybody by the time they die will have had some type of visionary experience. They're just much, much more common than we give them credit for. And I think it's the naturalism has just made cowards of all of us, and we just hesitate to talk about it. So even when you're in a church setting where you ought to feel good about mentioning these things, you really, at least in my circles, I don't hear people talking about them very much. Certainly not pastors from the pulpit talking about visionary experiences. Now, maybe if I were Pentecostal, I would hear it more, but I'm not in those circles. But why would we ignore it if this is a common experience that people need help interpreting?
It's an excellent question. It's very frustrating because there's this whole wealth of information that's out there, but it's almost like there's a conspiracy not to talk about it or bring it out into the public more. Um,
Yes, and so, like, just this week, my students, I have about 135 students this semester I'm working with, and it's an introduction to religion class. I have them read David Hume's famous essay or a chapter from one of Hume's books called Of Miracles, and it's Hume arguing against miracles. Now, he argues that, oh, all these miracle stories come from times and places that were pre-scientific or ignorant people, and they just don't really happen today. Why don't we see them from intelligent cultures and scientific cultures? And I would say, number one, Hume didn't seem to have interviewed anybody for his great declarations about miracles. But if he did, I think he would have found a lot of them. But since Moody, we've been interviewing people globally about this. We're finding out there are millions of Americans who are experiencing these type things, and millions of people from supposedly secularized Europe that are experiencing these things, that talk of encounters with angels and visions. So we need to start talking about them. If Christians don't start talking about them in relation to, hey, the Bible's got visions from the start to the finish. They're all over the Bible. Why should we be hesitant to talk about such things just because some people have taken these to extremes or spout false doctrine as a result of theirs? We need to do the hard work of differentiating the true from the false, thinking about them rather than going to the extremes of either dismissing all of them or accepting all of them. I think that's what 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about, is to consider them, think about them, evaluate such experiences. Don't just dismiss them all.
Absolutely. In the NDEs are often seen as new age type phenomena, not Christian phenomena. But in the book, you give 47 different Bible passages that support a Christian worldview being compatible with a near death experience.
Okay, so what I did there was I said, let's take the core experience, the things that people are experiencing over and over again. If you get into anomalous things that happen in 1% of NDEs, you can find aliens, you can find reincarnation, you can find Mormon doctrine, you can find all kinds of things if you get into the small percentage ones. But because some people are on drugs, some people have mental illness, they're coming from all kinds. You just can't accept every experience any more than a study of Tylenol. Does it work to cure headaches? You're going to have anomalous experiences there, which they have to think through. This is like any scientific study. But let's take the core experiences, the things that the best researchers find in almost all near death experiences, or I would say something as high as 20%, like seeing a tunnel or these. If you get into those high percentages, these are things that we're seeing regularly in them. Not all near death experiences have all the core elements. One person may die, come out of their body, see what's going on in their resuscitation, go back into their body, and that's it. They just saw their body. But when you get into 20 and 30% of the people saying they experienced something, this is a part of the core experience. So I said, what have the researchers found to be the core experience? Hey, there's a God, there's a being of light that seems to be consistent with what the Bible says about God. He's a personal God. There are a lot of worldviews that talk about an impersonal God. Maybe God is really a part of the universe, as pantheism would say. But he's not the kind of God that can answer prayer in pantheism. And yet, when people go to the other side of near death experience, they see an extremely personal God who communicates with them, who communicates love to them, who shows them about their life. This God was aware of everything about their lives. This is very parallel to what we're seeing in the Bible, where God is a just God who knows what we're up to in life, who cares about us intimately, who loves us, who is in communication with mankind and cares. He's not a deistic God who created the world and then went off somewhere else and didn't have anything to do with it. He knows what's going on. He cares about ourselves over and over. There's an afterlife. How do we know there's an afterlife? You get to the other side and you see long deceased relatives who may have been dead for decades. Where are they? If it's after these deceased relatives died, that is the afterlife, right? There is an afterlife. Again, the Bible talks about this. I found 47 or so areas of convergence with Christianity. I think it converges well with Christianity. When I look at some of the New Age claims, okay, God is really, when people die, and by the way, don't put New Age people in a box. That's a pretty broad designation. Some of them believe in reincarnation. Some of them may not. Some of them believe that we experience some kind of nirvana on the other side, not really a personal God. Some people don't believe that. But for those New Agers who believe in reincarnation, for example, that I'm not saying that near-death experiences totally deny that could ever happen. What I'm saying is that, number one, seeing all these deceased relatives who've been there for a number of years, that kind of shows evidence that at least some people are going to an eternity on the other side, and at least not immediately being reincarnated. Also, people are saying, okay, the general thing with people is that we go through multiple life after life until we get everything right. In other words, it's a works-based salvation. I don't think we see evidence of that in the core near-death experience. People like Moody's first book, Life After Life, was built on about 150 experiences. He said he didn't see reincarnation in any of those. Moody said, I'm not saying reincarnation doesn't happen. I'm just saying that's not a part of the experiences I looked at, and doesn't seem to be a core experience for the near-death experience. But anyway, my basic thing was I saw a very good correspondence of historic Christianity with the near-death experience when you're looking at the core experience. And I was shocked to see that. I'd never studied it before and was amazed that there was such a close correspondence.
When I wrote my book, The God Conclusion, I went at it because I read Richard Dawkins and his book, The God Delusion, and I was trying to respond to him. And there was one thing in particular that he said there. He said, there's no such thing as any supernatural entities. There's no fairies, no ghosts, no God, nothing supernatural. It has to be natural. That started me on a quest to learn as much as I could. I look at myself as a seeker of information, a seeker of truth. And
so were you an atheist or an agnostic when you first read Dawkins?
no, I was already a Christian, but it's funny. I was a computer software professional. So I had virtually no exposure to the natural sciences beyond college. Just hadn't been keeping up with it. One night I was working on a business plan for a friend of mine, business, and Dawkins was in the background on the Colbert Report, and he said that cars and computers are intelligently designed, but the human body is not.
Mm-hmm.
And that struck me as something that was almost indefensible to say, but he was a biologist and I was an amateur just trying to learn. I seem to have lost you. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.